All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We'll get started with the presentation, and if you have any questions, please just drop them in the chat or use the Q&A function. Today we're going to be talking about the Wetlands Impact Tracker. This is a project that we released about a week and a half to 2 weeks ago, tracking U.S. Army Corps of Engineer public notices. My name is Matthew Vining. I am a policy analyst with Atlas Public Policy, working primarily in tracking developments in the EV market, as well as the developing manufacturing space in the clean economy. I will pass it to Gabe to introduce himself.
Everyone, hope you're doing well today. My name is Gabe Watson. I work at Environmental Policy Innovation Center, EPIC for short. I run our data science and applications program, our side of things. Really excited to talk about this project, show some of the results, and I'll pass it over to Scott.
I think Scott is having difficulties joining, so we might just have to move on for now while he joins. Gabe, do you mind troubleshooting that while I get started?
Yeah, no problem.
All right, everybody. So just a bit of run of show today. We're going to cover the background of this tool, what a public notice is, how this project came to be, and then we'll dive a bit into a demo of the tool if you're not familiar with how it's used and what it looks like. And then we'll go more under the hood, thinking about what kind of data we can collect from this tool, how the code and AI has been incorporated into the process here, and some findings that we've found from the data ourselves. And then lastly, we'll end on some next steps and a quick Q&A for any questions we might have. So starting with the background, this project evolved from a conversation on a Justice 40 open call between Scott Eustace at Healthy Golf and Gabe from EPIC. If you look on the right, this is kind of a mock-up or a alpha version, if you will, of the dashboard when data had to be manually collected. This is a project that Scott took on. So there's things like permit application numbers, looking at how large the impacts of those proposed projects are, where they're located, and also a source to the site. So this was really our foundation and our building block into what the dashboard is now. And so thinking about this, both Atlas and some graduate students from MDI, the Massive Data Institute at Georgetown, joined this effort, and we have come to create the Wetlands Impact Tracker. And going into this project, some of our concerns included wetlands losses, oil and gas projects, and the rise of those, especially LNG exports, as well as a lack of or inability of communities to provide input on these projects being proposed in their communities. And so from that information, and given the scope of things, we landed on 4 districts for this tool. We are looking at the Galveston district, the New Orleans district, Mobile, and the Jacksonville district, which also includes Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So it lines this Gulf Coast area right here. And now I'm going to continue with a bit more background. Gabe, did Scott get in, or is he still having difficulty? If not,
I'm not sure, but I can pick up here.
Okay, sounds good.
So this dashboard is revealing public notices. And one question y'all might have is, what is a public notice? This is different than a permit application in the sense that those are the documents and whatnot that someone who's proposing a project might submit to the Corps. A public notice is really the first period that the public has to contribute comment on a particular project. In short, it's a request from the government to bring information on whether the losses to wetlands or waters of the United States are worth the benefit from a project. It goes without saying that wetlands and other associated waters of the United States are incredibly helpful for one, as an environment unto themselves, two, in terms of their benefits for protecting against flooding, habitat, and a variety of other things. So the Army Corps of Engineers releases within the public notice some key fields. There's the name of the applicant, the location of work, the character of work, if there's any mitigation that needs to occur because of losses. And this, again, is sort of the first chance that the public has to leave comment. In addition to the notice itself, there will also be sort of a public comment period, roughly 15 to 30 days, that the public have to submit comment on a particular project. Especially in the districts that we focused on, in areas within the district, some of these communities are getting a significant number of notices and requests for comment, and it can be very burdensome for folks, particularly as we think about large industrial scale projects occurring in communities without resources to basically leave a thorough public comment, especially if there's a large number of them. If you want to go to next slide.
Hey, Gabe, I'm here.
Sweet. You can pick up where I left off, Scott.
Right. Public notices. Hey, everyone. I'm Scott Eustace, he, him, Healthy Gulf Community Science Director, and I've been reviewing these notices and caring for our wetlands in the Gulf for 12 years. Yeah, what's in the public notice? A lot of different details. There's the part of the government we elect and part of the government that is select, the smart people at the agencies that are implementing the laws, in this case, the Clean Water Act. The Army Corps of Engineers, the federal agency implementing the Clean Water Act. It's called Section 404. Decisions about whether to destroy this or that wetland, because wetlands clean the water, so destroying them can unclean the water. There's a lot of information in these notices. It's all in jargon, and you can see kind of the bolded areas: character of work, location, mitigation. But a lot of that jargon is pretty impenetrable to local people, and the government is asking, although they're very smart, they don't know everything. So they're asking local people to give them the information they don't have. And that can be overwhelming, particularly in areas where you have a lot of cumulative impacts. People think they've commented already, or what, another one? There's a lot of context missing in each individual notice, of course, because the government has to take each decision separately. But there's a lot that, if you're a member of the public receiving this, there's a lot of context missing. So the next one is, including the cumulative impacts, all the decisions that the government is making around that one. We know the Army Corps has their database of the decisions they make. It's called the ORM or ORM. I think it's called the Operations Resource Management Database. They have a public version at the website URL in the slide, but then there's context missing from the public notice, and that website, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, is documenting the loss of our United States wetlands through their status and trends reports and their National Wetlands Inventory Program that looks at aerial photography. So, there's a lot of outside information that we'd like to bring to the government as they make these decisions. And next slide. And there's social context as well. There's really particular areas that get a lot of notices, but sometimes that can bring wealth and prosperity to a community. In terms of building rooftops, this is an area of Louisiana. It's a well-to-do white area, and all of the dots in that screen cap from our tracker have to do with subdivisions, bringing tax revenue to the parish. If for someone like Michael there, that's the Chifuncta River keeper, that person needs the Army Corps to consider all the cumulative impacts of all of these subdivision after subdivisions polluting the Chifuncta River. Next slide. In other places, the social context is a bit different. The Army Corps is making a tremendous amount of wetland decisions in the river parishes of Louisiana, or known as Cancer Alley. And those decisions have to do with placing industrial facilities in wetlands. And at Healthy Gulf, we object to that for a number of reasons. There's probably much better places to put these things that are more geologically stable. And of course, we have to consider environmental justice considerations. But we have, the cumulative impacts to the wetlands is bad, and then we're also asking the Corps to consider the cumulative impacts to the air as well. And also, they really, we need more consideration of environmental justice concerns, because this is the type of project where the wealth flows to somebody, but not to the local people. And next one. And again, not Sarasota, excuse me. Santa Rosa County, Florida has a tremendous amount of notices, 45 in the review period that we sampled. Again, a lot of that is residential and commercial development, as opposed to Lower Plaquemines Parish on the West Bank, Louisiana. Also 45 public notices, but often due to industrial developments, in this case, Plaquemines LNG, completely industrializing what was a Native American and lower income fishing area, and putting industrial facilities into this environmental justice community, putting that and maybe 3 more LNG facilities. So the context, the social context often determines what type of project is going into those wetlands. Also, our tracker, if you go to the next slide, because it's tracking the acreages of these applications and not just the number, it can give us some insight, we hope, into the changing policies around what wetlands are protected and which are not. This is what's called a jurisdictional determination. The Army Corps has a biologist which determines all the wetlands on the property. This is the Shell Convent refinery as they convert it to an ammonia plant in St. James Parish. And this jurisdictional determination said that some of the wetlands in red are going to be protected by the Corps, and some in pink are not going to be, because there is less of a surface connection of water. And this was under the previous Supreme Court decision, Rampanos. But if this decision were made under the new decision, which is called Sackett, some of that, there might be less of the red area and more of the pink, if that makes any sense. But because our tracker, unlike the Corps' website, is tracking acreages, we should be able to get some insight into that. And district by district, there might be different ways that the Corps is implementing the decision. So it's important to have a tracker that can pull out the changes district by district. So with that, I think let's look at the tracker.
All right, I'm going to take back over and do a bit of demo of the dashboard itself. Can I get a verbal confirmation that you can see my screen here?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right, everybody. So when you follow the link to the dashboard, which I'm sure is something that's been going around your inboxes, or how you might have heard about this webinar, the dashboard will show up on a landing page like so. It's hosted on Atlas Public Policy's Climate Program Portal, which follows a lot of federal developments from the IRA or the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so when you reach this landing page, it has a couple sentences of information at the top describing what the dashboard's use is and what kind of information is located here, as well as a help and methodology section at the top. If you can't retain a lot of information I'm going to throw at you in these next 5 to 8 minutes, I highly recommend the methodology section, because it's very useful to be able to read what kind of data fields are being collected here and where that data is exactly sourced from and what it means. So the dashboard itself is organized into 2 tabs. There's an overview tab and a notice details tab. The overview tab, which is what you see right now, is a aggregated level like a macro scale of all the data that we've collected. And so as you can see, a couple of the key metrics that we've decided to highlight at the top here are, first and foremost, how many notices we've been able to collect from the data that's been published on these 4 districts' websites, as well as, of those, how much of these have enough information that work with our code to map them to this map below. There's also, we wanted to highlight the percent of these proposed projects in these public notices that are located in disadvantaged communities, as well as of those projects, how many are classified as oil and gas. And then also, which I think is a very important thing for advocates in this region who are interested in providing public comment on these proposed developments, is the open for comment metric as well. And if you see this orange highlighted color, this represents AI fields that have been extracted. So these are data fields that using AI have been extracted using a prompt, which we'll describe later how that logic works. But just wanted to caution users to take extra care when they look at these types of data fields. So going a little bit deeper in, there's also some slicers or filters that are easier to filter out data if you're looking for a specific geographic area. That goes by district, but also you can look at map location by state and also down to the county level. There's also specific date windows if you're interested in a specific date, if you know what you're looking for. And there's also these notice categories. And these are 16 pre-selected categories that we developed as a team that look at the language used in these notices and categorize them in different areas. So maybe I'm interested in looking at port developments. So I can click there and see all the notices that have been categorized as port developments or port construction. And so these are just a couple examples of different types of filters you can apply. And I'm going to show how to interact with the map because I think that's one of the coolest features that we have here and probably one of the features that most people will interact with. So there's a bunch of different points that each represent a different public notice on this map. On the right, you can see, based on the criteria you've applied, how many locations you'll be looking at. Because I haven't applied anything right now, I see the full locations. But say I'm a user who wants to look at comment period statuses that are open. So I can go there, and then maybe specifically I want to look at this one, which is conveniently located in the Galveston district. Hovering over it, I can see the county it's located in, the block group population, and also how many acres are being impacted here. Now, if I click specifically on this dot, I have a single permit location selected. Once that happens, I can see more details. So this graphic here will pop up, and I'll click on that in a second. However, I did want to also highlight that below the map, you'll also see a table of summaries, a summary table of all the permits that you are able to look at depending on the criteria you've supplied. So because I'm only looking at one right now, I see this specific notice. It's in Texas, and I can see who filed this notice, a quick summary of what it's about, as well as links to the exact web page and the PDF documentation if I want to read through that. So going to see more details, this brings us to the second page, and I can see more information about this specific notice itself. Again, there's some similar information like the links to the web page and the PDF, but also it shows me things like what this project location looks like. So I can see it's in some canal or river of some type, and also based on satellite imagery, I can see there's a lot of industrial development around it. There's also a project summary provided, a character of work that's self-described by the applicant themselves. And then if they mention any planned mitigation in this public notice, that appears there as well. And then lastly, there's some information about the impacted area. The AI integrated into this type of dashboard allows us to see the total acres impacted by the proposed project, as well as if they're calculated as a loss or a restoration effort. And then also, if you're interested in questions about this specific notice or maybe submitting public comment, there is the project manager detail and contact information located here. And finally, we also wanted to include some population metrics that are related to the specific location of this notice. So I can see things like how this area compares in terms of median household income and population under a certain poverty threshold, the national income being the yellow line. I can also see the breakdown based on the block group level of the population here, based on different ethnicities and races. So for the sake of time, I will stop there, but if there are any specific questions about how the dashboard operates, how you can use it, etc., I can answer those towards the end. All right. Gabe, on to you.
Sweet. Thank you, Matthew. Can everyone see me? Maybe.
Unfortunately, no.
No.
Oh, okay.
I enabled your camera, and if you turn on your camera, you can't. It doesn't show up.
Yeah, it's all good. I'll just be a floating head here. So thank you, Matthew, for that walkthrough. I want to talk a little bit about how the system actually works and how we're scraping information from the PDF. So the graph that you see on the right is basically taking the differences or character of the notices and plotting them against a two-dimensional graph and breaking it out by district. And by the colors, you can see that this is essentially saying, well, how are the notices constructed from a text perspective, and how does an AI model interpret those differences across districts? This is to indicate basically the challenge that we have to pull this information out, in the sense that these notices are written by people, and there are nuances and differences associated with each notice and across districts. And if you could go to next slide. So in terms of the process to convert those text to numbers, our first step is to access the Army Corps website and to capture the URL. So each notice has a unique website page associated with it. And on there, there's some brief information, as well as a link to the PDF where the full notice is stored. We capture and download that full notice, and then parse the text, read the PDF, and basically generate a full body of text that's stored within the PDF. Once we have that text, we then use two methods. First is regex, or regular expression identification. And here we're basically searching for specific terms, for example, lat long, or the date that a public comment might be open for. However, because of those differences that I talked about in the slide previous, there's a lot of nuances and difficulties that regex has to deal with. And it was very clear during the onset and while we were developing the scraping methodology that AI would be a perfect application. So we use large language models in addition to regular expression identification to both pull out those discrete pieces of information, as well as understanding, as Scott had mentioned earlier, that the notice context, the character of work that's in the PDFs can sometimes be difficult to read and understand. So we also summarize that information to a more understandable level, and we shorten it a bit so you can get the gist of the project and understand if this is a project worth following up with a public comment. We then output the data into 6 main subtables. So we have the project manager and the contact information at Army Corps. We have the character of work text, which is verbatim pulled from the notice PDF. We have the location, so that's that dot that you are seeing on the map. And being able to pull out lat longs and area information was definitely a challenge for this project. As well as if any mitigation was identified because of potential losses or impacts to waters of the United States and wetlands. We also have that AI generated summary. And the very last piece, which is I think one of the more important pieces, is that project impact. What are the losses? Are they temporary or permanent to a particular type of ecosystem? If you could go next slide here. So here's sort of a good example of the challenge in taking this text and converting it into numerical or quantitative information. So a sample of one of the notices: initially, the authorized project proposed that approximately 7.169 acres of forested swamp wetlands would be temporarily impacted during project construction, but were reduced to 5.873 acres. So this kind of highlights there are two quantitative numbers here, both of which contain acres, both of which are tied to forested swamp wetlands, but that modifier "but" at the end sort of indicates, no, we actually want to pull that 5.873 rather than that 7.169. Might be a small difference, but when we're aggregating across all of the projects, it definitely can be significant in terms of the accuracy and scale of the information. A good question here in terms of how the training of the model was performed. So we didn't necessarily, well, we did have a training data set, but a big component of our work was to do many runs of validation. And so this looks like looking at the information that was generated from the regular expression identification and from the LLM model against the actual notice. So Matthew and I would hop on like a 3-hour call together, and we would sit down and look at the notices, read through them, see the outputs, and understand if the correct information was gathered or not. And then we would say, hey, development team, here are the improvements. Here's where the model was very accurate, and here's where there's room for improvement, or the wrong number was caught, and we were able to identify patterns based on the notices in places where our system was getting caught up. If you could go next slide here. So moving away from process and into results, as Matthew indicated, we pulled 6,055 notices from the Army Corps system. 4,386 of those notices we were able to get geographic information into map. 398 of them were classified as oil and gas. 1,622 were in CGEST, and CGEST is the Climate Economic Justice Screening Tool developed by the Council on Environmental Quality. That's an environmental justice tool that makes a determination in terms of if a community is faced a certain number of impacts based on a variety of different data sets, from air pollution to population loss, climate change impacts, and whatnot. 3,028 of our notices had proposed wetland impacts, and there's an estimated 86,572 acres of proposed wetland impacts. If you notice, I'm using the term proposed because these are notices. These are not sort of at the end of the project, what was the actual outcome. So we do understand that when we're talking about this data, it's not set in stone if these impacts actually occurred, but some of our next steps are to understand better exactly how a notice and a proposed impact actually might lead to an actualized impact on the environment. Go on, next slide here. So just focusing a bit on oil and gas notices, we can see that Galveston District and New Orleans District have the lion's share of oil and gas projects. And this is oil and gas sort of refers generally to the downstream infrastructure that's the result of oil and gas or petrochemical resource extraction. So natural gas, oil, and those products need to be refined or exported, thinking about LNG terminals, refineries, ethylene crackers to generate base fuels and materials for plastics. We see that there's a big spike basically from 2011 roughly to 2014. 2014 to COVID, there's a big drop off in the number of projects proposed, and then there's a big spike post-COVID. Right now, the U.S. is at an all-time high for oil and gas production, and that results in such a large number of these downstream infrastructure projects, which are quite large and not only have considerations for greenhouse gas emissions, as well as impacts to wetlands and the people that live around them. If we go next slide here. So this is looking at a map generally of the post-2020 wetland losses, just a subset, and we're also looking at oil, gas, and commercial projects. So we can see along the Atlantic coast of Florida, as well as the Gulf Coast, a number of these projects are commercial. We're thinking about subdivision development, urban sprawl, if you will. And then if we look in the New Orleans and Galveston district, as I mentioned earlier, that's where we see a large proportion of the impacts related to oil and gas development. Next slide here. So to dig into the data just a little bit more, and again, to talk about CJEST, or the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, what we've done here is taken the thresholds that encompass CJEST. CJEST does make a binary distinction if an area is disadvantaged or not, but there's a lot of nuance in disadvantaged communities. So what we've done is sort of break out the thresholds that result in that binary determination. So that's what you see on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, we have projects per 10,000 people. So what you see as you move to the right of the graph, or an increase in the number of thresholds that a census tract is exceeding based on the CJEST input data sets, we see that the projects per capita increase. We see that the oil and gas per capita projects increase, as well as the wetland losses increase. So again, kind of back to what Scott was saying in terms of the social context around these projects, and that certain communities are receiving a different type of project compared to another one. And certain projects might bring along increase in wealth and prosperity, but others, in the case of oil and gas, have a lot of detrimental effects on the folks who live next door. And also, it's important to mention that from the perspective of wetlands, they don't necessarily care if it's an oil and gas project or if it's a subdivision. That loss is still the same. And if we go next slide. So this map is basically a spatial view of the previous chart. So we see areas with high DA or DAC disadvantage status also have high wetland loss, and that projects look different in different communities. So if we see, if we look at the areas that are in that gray color, particularly in the New Orleans area, those are areas that have high wetland losses, as well as a high proportion of the community is disadvantaged based on the CJEST determination. And then if we look at Florida, especially towards the tip, we see areas that have high wetland losses, but are not necessarily disadvantaged communities. So we're thinking more around those commercial and subdivision developments. And then next slide here. So the scope of this project was definitely tailored down to use our resources to focus on those 4 districts in the Gulf area, as well as focusing on oil and gas and identifying the notices which had that information. First and foremost, we've been improving the large language models that have worked to get the data out of these notices along the way, but we know that there is progress to be made, and we can definitely improve the system. So that's sort of our first charge, is to tweak and improve models. There's also a thought that there are 32 other Army Corps districts around the country, and we've just covered 4 of them. Certain areas are going to have different types of issues other than or including oil and gas. So expanding to the other 28 districts we see as an important next step. We also want to have a note that this is taking data sort of once Army Corps releases it, and makes it public in their system. But what would it look like if Army Corps had better data entry systems, and this information was able to be displayed by Army Corps themselves? This was a super fun project, really enjoyed it, but the hope would be that in the future, Army Corps could potentially take this on and be able to display this information, as well as have better data systems for entering things like wetland losses, project location, and whatnot. Also a nod to other existing databases and platforms that are in a similar subject field. So there's Oil and Gas Watch, which is developed by Environmental Integrity Project, and that's tracking in a more robust way in terms of the development permitting process around oil and gas development. So we recognize that our platform has a lot of overlap with theirs, and thinking about how the two can connect. There's also that database that Scott mentioned earlier in terms of the wetland impact database. And as I noted in a few previous slides, that the notices are just proposed, and we have a lot of ideas in terms of how to validate if those proposed losses, what they look like in terms of a few years down the line when the project is actually instantiated. And do those impacts match up with the number of acres that were said to be impacted? Is it less or more? So we've thought about using the National Land Cover data set, which is done at 3-year intervals and would give us a really robust data set to be able to compare against our proposed losses in terms of what's actually occurring on the ground. And for the most part, that's sort of what we've had in the long list of things that we'd like to do after this project. If you could, next slide here. Just wanted to put up our contact information if folks want to get in touch for follow-up and ask any additional questions. I also want to give a special thanks to Mohit at Atlas, who did the development of the dashboard, Jin Yu at Georgetown, who worked extensively on this project, Nikila also at Georgetown Massive Data Institute, who did the MVP to see if this project was viable, as well as EcoMap and other reviewers who gave us incredible feedback along the way. And that's all I've got. I think we're due for a question and answer.
If anybody has any questions, you can feel free to throw them in the chat, or I can also unmute you if you want to ask your question, if you raise your hand. But yeah, I just wanted to save this last few 15 minutes for any questions you might have. Or if there's anything you want us to go back on this presentation, also more than happy to talk about that. We also have both Mo and Kumar here, who worked on really like the majority of the coding work here and working with the AI system here, who could provide more insight to more technical questions as well. Okay, Kent, I see you have your hand up. I allowed your mic, so you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Kent Wimmer with Defenders of Wildlife in Tallahassee. Florida has assumed 404 permitting in most of the waters in Florida, but the state's current online permitting, commenting, tracking system is challenging at best and very challenging to use. We need greater oversight of wetland destruction in Florida. You folks interested in helping us figure out how to do that? I mean, the Corps is only getting just, just the main rivers now. The state's handling the rest.
Yes, sir. This is Scott. I'm in New Orleans. Our Christian Wagley is our Pensacola staff member. My email is in the chat. Please send me a line and let's chat. I will say that as far as this project goes, we still see the Jacksonville district producing the notices. So I'm unclear. I know that the state has taken over the decisions, but I need to catch up with what's been happening. As far as the data that's being collected by the project, it still seems like we're getting the same volume of notices as we did from a few years back. So, but I think that's something we'll be able to help evaluate and focus on in the future.
Thank you. I know Christian well, so thank you.
Excellent. Oh, cool.
I see there's a couple comments in the chat. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Virginia. There aren't any other questions. We'll be here. We'll stick around, obviously. Okay, I see Jesse has a question. Okay, you should be able to unmute now. I unmuted you, Jesse. I'm not sure if you're able to unmute yourself, but you do have access to. Maybe Scott, Gabe, if you have anything else to add about the project itself or the work you do, I think that could be a good point for this as well.
Virginia from South Wings have posted in the chat. Southwings.org is a good organization. It allows us to check up on some of these wetlands, and the photograph of the LNG terminal was done with the assistance of a South Wings pilot. So thank you, Virginia. Thank you, South Wings. Maybe just to state, just from, in the past, as a Gulf-wide organization, looking at 7 notices a week in New Orleans and 7 notices a week in Jacksonville, it was just a very taxing experience. It's just, I think this project is saving my hair. I think pre-COVID, we would have 3 or 4 interns just trying to database some of these items. And then that program fell off completely with the virus. So just in terms of our workflow, just seeing what comment periods are open and where they are is tremendously useful and saves me a lot of time.
Looks like we have another question. With changes to WOTUS from the 2023 SCOTUS ruling, we expect a reduction in regulated wetlands. That makes me concerned that if wetland impacts put in notices is the data used to track proposed wetland impacts, it could reflect downward trends and impacts when the reality is fewer federally regulated wetlands. And they want to know if this is an issue that can be addressed with refinements to the models used for pulling the data, and if you're able to describe more about that.
Yeah. So far, some of the applications we've seen in New Orleans that we expected to be, where we knew the project was coming and we expected the wetlands to be exempt, have not been. I know that the Supreme Court specifically mentioned Louisiana and the Mississippi River in the decision. There is another data source, which would be, if you were solely focused on this question, getting the jurisdictional determinations would be the way to make sure you're tracking that. I do think we'll be able to see it just by looking at trends in wetland permits. But you're right in that the direct source is the jurisdictional determinations and tracking those over time. Unfortunately, there's no public notice system for this is AJD and JDs. Those have to be FOIA'd from the Army Corps of Engineers. That map that I showed was the result of a Freedom of Information Act request. So at this time, the data practices of the Army Corps don't really allow an automated data collection system. If you're worried about that, and even our old, intern method would not be very productive because it can take months for response to FOIA. I think maybe let's just continue to talk about pushing the Corps to have more open data practices. But as of right now, those jurisdictional determinations, you can see on the Army Corps' website for the ORM where the Corps, most of the places where the Corps is making those determinations, but you don't see any maps, you don't see any acreages. So we'd have to work together to push the Corps to open more of their data.
And I will point out the last point about unregulated impacts that Army Corps review permits if it's interacting with what is under their jurisdiction for wetlands and what they call the nation's navigable waters. So that's a link that I also included, or that we've also included on the dashboard. But I don't know if that was also a second part of the question, but I did see that, so I wanted to highlight that. I also see that, Christopher, you have a question. You should be unmuted, or you should be mic allowable.
Yeah, sorry, real quick. I just wanted to flag the question Jesse couldn't get out, which was basically on one of the slides where we're looking at the impacts to wetlands, just the overall stats and maybe what surprised our folks who worked on this project and digging in. Yeah, so if y'all have any responses there.
I can go first and then I'll hand it over to Gabe and Scott. I think for me, I was pretty surprised about the high percentage of these proposed projects in disadvantaged communities, especially when it came to oil and gas. We noticed that projects categorized as oil and gas had a higher percentage of being located in a disadvantaged community than the entire data set as a whole. Gabe, Scott?
I think I expected some of the dots to be bigger, but maybe what we're missing is temporary versus total impacts. But they're usually pretty big either way. I think this largely reflects where I work and what I'm concerned about. We know about those environmental justice concerns. The environmental justice movement and those organizations are mainly focused on air. And so it wasn't a big surprise that there's also, I think maybe the surprise is that there is a parallel wetlands impact, or that we're building refineries in wetlands. But it mostly was expected. And in fact, if you go to the other one that had the two axes of DA communities and high loss communities, you'll see Cameron Parish pop out. And that's a place that's been in the news lately about all of the LNG proposals that are now paused. A lot of the community advocates in the news in the last week, getting all over CNN, who've been in DC. They're from that area that in the dark square down there in Cameron Parish. So that map in particular is like, oh yeah, that checks out. That's the folks who are very agitated about the loss of lands, of their fishing grounds, and their air quality from these industrial impacts, and that the Biden administration has been responding to. So that checked out. We didn't, this data collection and analysis was done long before those announcements, but that made sense.
I think for me, what really stuck out was the proportion of commercial and suburban development that existed in our data set, as well as a significant amount of dredging, fill, and movement of earth, rather than sort of a total erasure of wetlands. There was one project, or a few projects from 2019, which was about 20,000 acres of movement of earth, and just really the sheer scale of some of these projects are kind of mind-boggling. And there's a question here from Jesse in terms of point data versus polygon data. We weren't able to get polygon data in terms of the actual shape of the projects. There would be sometimes a bounding box. So 4 pairs of lat long information so that we could say generally, you know, what's the footprint of the project. But I think that the footprint in polygon itself is a really crucial part of the question, both in terms of the communities that are tied to the specific projects, as well as just the sheer scale of them. So still an outstanding question if we can get that data from the Corps. A lot of the notices do have project plans, and at one point there was a thought to take those plans and put them on a map, but wasn't within you know, our resources for this. So all of what you see in terms of area is based on information in the notices sort of written out saying the proposed project is such and such acres in size, but exactly how that falls on the land, we were unable to deduce from the notice.
And again, the Corps has improved in requiring GIS information. Most of these applicants are going to have that privately, but I can say the New Orleans district has changed their policy so that I think it's as of January 2020, the GIS information should be submitted to the Corps, mainly for these questions of jurisdictional determination. So it is, that information might be starting to be FOIA-able, if that's a word, but it is not presented on in any, you know, automatic or machine readable format. And I think the Corps might say, you know, if we started FOIA-ing, then they would say, hey, can you ask Congress to give us more budget and to hire more staff if you're going to be requesting all that information? So those polygons are becoming more publicly available and not exclusively privately held. Excuse me. But the government hasn't been publishing them to any kind of machine readable interface as of now.
So we are at 2 more minutes. Any concluding thoughts from our presenters? Again, I'm sharing the screen if you would like to get in contact. If you have follow-up questions or issues, suggestions on how we could improve the way the dashboard's designed for user interface, if you'd like to collaborate in the future on our future iterations of the dashboard and build out, would love to chat.
Yeah, I just want to thank
The Chesapeake
everybody,
region. Yeah.
everybody, and thanks Matthew and Gabe, Shinyu, Kumar, Mohit, doing incredible work. That's really helping us out on the Gulf, and yeah, see the invite to come to the Chesapeake, and we're hoping to expand in the next iteration. So thank all of you for listening today.
Thanks, everybody.